everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Weena, and currently I'm very happy to say that I am a candidate for graduation from the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing program of DLSU Manila. And today we're going to be talking about my specialization of choice, poetry. Out of all the genres of literature, I've found that people are the most intimidated by and the most hesitant to get into poetry. I've heard it so many times on BookTube, people reviewing poetry books and saying poetry just isn't for me, or I don't really get poetry. And I think this generalization of a genre just not being for someone is something kind of unique to poetry. I very rarely hear people say fiction just isn't for me or essays just aren't for me, and somehow there's an implied kind of difficulty that sort of carries over from the specific difficult poems that people encounter to the genre in general. This case, I think, is not just online. I also saw it back when I was teaching literature at Enderun colleges, where a lot of my students would really enjoy the fiction side of things, the creative nonfiction side of things, but then they would just completely disengage when it came to poetry. And even on a more advanced level, in my MFA batch in LaSalle, out of 12 of us in the batch, there were just 2 of us, like just me and Austere, that took up poetry. So, you know, I suspect that this is really because of that general intimidation when it comes to poetry and just this idea that poetry should be a certain way. This suspicion was also kind of given affirmation when I asked you guys on Instagram to let me know if you've ever been intimidated by poetry and what it was exactly that you found intimidating. So in today's video, with your responses in mind, I'll be talking about some ways in which we can kind of try to get over that intimidation with poetry. Because yeah, difficult as it can be, you guys also unanimously voted that you would be willing to give it a try if you could find a way to kind of get over that intimidation. Hopefully these 2 arguments or frames of mind that I'll be presenting in this video can act as kind of an olive branch toward giving poetry another chance. The first thesis I'd like to suggest is to think of poetry like you would music. One of the things that people brought up on Instagram was meter, and as I'm sure a lot of us have noticed, poetry and music have a lot of the same elements. Meter, rhyme, symbolism, and even brevity of language. If you look at most songs, they're under 3 minutes long, unless of course you're Madame Taylor Swift, but that is the exception. And just like music, I think the best way to appreciate poetry isn't always by going straight to the super technical, super classical stuff. I mean, how many of us have become music lovers by thinking about like 3/4 meter or jumping headfirst into Mozart's Allegro? I'm guessing less than 5% of us. And in that vein, how many of us have also been put off from things like playing the piano or learning guitar by that sort of emphasis on technical and very classical education? I'm not saying that you shouldn't dive into the deeper stuff. I definitely encourage that. I mean, I'm a creative writing major, but I'm saying that studying the technical stuff should always enhance your appreciation of art and not take away from it. Love for music, or at least an appreciation of it, I think begins with something that connects to the human experience, something that can latch on to something you already know or have seen or have experienced, or just something that's catchy. And so, to illustrate what I mean, we are going to study one of the most famous songs of all time, Backstreet Boys' I Want It That Way. In the first few lines of I Want It That Way, you'll see that the line cuts or the intentional pauses create a feedback loop of suspense and satisfaction. Once they say my fire, we're already given a hint because we already have the schema or prior knowledge associating fire and love, and we know that the persona in the song, so like the narrator in the song, is speaking to the object of affection or desire. And I think the next 2 lines that follow are very important because they exhibit the relationship between clarity and ambiguity, which are always a balancing act. The first two lines have clearly told us that this is going to be about love, but the next lines make space for us to be able to be curious and to want to investigate. What do they want us to believe in? What way does the persona want this relationship to be? And this is one of the things that I think makes poetry and music beautiful. It isn't always about saying this is A and it says that B. Poetry doesn't really give us answers, it gives us questions. It's a door opening, not a door closing, and that doesn't mean that it can't be satisfying or emotionally relatable. After all, what's more human experience-esque than being in a constant state of wonder? By the time that we get to the chorus, we're fully invested, and that's what makes us want to belt out, "Tell me why." This portion, I actually want to highlight the kinds of rhymes that are employed to make it more musical. We have different types of rhymes happening here. For heartache and mistake, we call those end rhymes because the ending syllables are the rhymes. And then we have internal rhymes. So just from the word, you can kind of infer it means rhymes that are not at the end of the words. And particularly here, we have assonance in the way mistake and say repeat the A sound toward the end. So it still creates a feeling of continuity throughout the poem or the song poem. In addition to contributing to affect, cutting the lines and putting the pauses in a certain place also creates multiple lines of meaning within what we would ordinarily formulate as a sentence, giving emphasis to certain themes. By putting "tell me why" in one line, there's emphasis on confession. There's also an emphasis on estrangement. So of course you wouldn't say this to someone that is currently in your life, someone that you're currently in a relationship with. This is a lot more effective than just putting this in a sentence, and I think this is where we see how poetry really helps highlight these emotional nuances. If this had been a straight sentence, it would be, "Tell me why ain't nothing but a heartache," which doesn't make any sense. Alright, now let's look at a poem called Forms of Love by George Oppen. Forms of Love by George Oppen. Parked in the fields all night so many years ago, we saw a lake beside us when the moon rose, I remember. Leaving that ancient car together, I remember. Standing in the white grass beside it, we groped our way together downhill in the bright, incredible light. Beginning to wonder whether it could be lake or fog, we saw our heads ringing under the stars. We walked to where it would have wet our feet had it been water. First, let's look at the images that we know have a specific recall. A moonlit night, a parked car, the mention of many years ago. We know that it's a memory tinted with nostalgia. We're given hints that this is a memory because of "together, I remember," like how that line is cut. We're also given some hints because of the word choice. So, for example, there's a portion that uses the word groped. When do you grope someone or something? I don't think you grope like your ball pen, or you don't grope your friend, right? It's always a verb that is reserved for deep desire. In the poem, our expectations for water or wetness are set up in the 4th and 5th lines. And again, this recalls like a lot of very sensual imagery. We saw a lake beside us is the line that sort of sets us up expecting water. So we think from movies, from things we've seen, like, what are the romantic things you can do by a lake, right? Go skinny dipping, get wet together. So throughout the poem, we are expecting something romantic, something filled with the potential thrills of nakedness and vulnerability. And when we get to the end, the last line reveals exactly what the poem is about. This is a poem about disappointment, dryness, thinking about what could have been, and now enters the ever-important ambiguity. We're still left wondering what happened to these lovers. Why didn't it work out? Why is the persona still remembering this all of these years in the future? And these questions are more important and give us stronger emotional responses than if the author had told us, well, they got together, but he had a drinking problem and she found someone else, so they split up. The destination is not the point, oftentimes, in poetry. The exploration is the point. Final note for this portion, I'd also like to emphasize that just like with music, there are also types of poetry which are more challenging and yes, harder to appreciate, but which grow on you over time. So for example, someone who loves the Backstreet Boys as a beginner for music may eventually end up falling in love with avant-garde artists like Bjork, or more witchy, like, you know, obscure people like Florence from Florence and the Machine. Or you might not. You might love pop for your whole life, you know, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, and that's completely up to you. But it would be a shame not to listen just because you're afraid to. The second line of reasoning that I would like to propose is to think of poetry in terms of a game, and in particular a crossword puzzle. This line of reasoning, I hope, will help bring clarity to the second most common thing that you guys said you found intimidating: form, or the physical structure of the poem. So length of the lines shapes the architecture of the poem on the page. For today, we won't really jump into philosophy and language games and all of that, because that could be a whole other video. So for now, we will focus on how you can approach form and try to see what it does in a poem. At the times, I think, when we think of form in poems, especially like super complicated ones, we just think of them as sentences that have been fragmented and scattered across the page. And so we have difficulty figuring them out because we're kind of grading our understanding or non-understanding of them based on linear sense that we encounter in prose. But form in poetry is its own machine. It has its own logic, and it has its own kind of rules outside the straightforward world of prose. And because of this, I would suggest kind of thinking of form and fragmentation as the poet kind of telling you what the rules of the game are by inference. So if you think of each poem as a game, you can think each game is different. The rules vary per poem, and to figure out these rules, you kind of go by clues, which is very similar to me in how they function to a crossword puzzle. And just like a crossword puzzle, you don't have to beat yourself up for not getting it the first time. And as your vocabulary expands, you may also find it easier to figure things out as you encounter more poetry. I chose the crossword puzzle as the main example for this section of the video because the reference to clues and word placement are just spot on. In particular, the placement of certain words in poems hint at how you're supposed to proceed and hint at what you should be looking at next. It's quite similar to how in poetry, the words and themes that your eye is drawn to on the page can kind of hint at what you're supposed to be looking for next and what those things mean. Those can be kind of like the shared letters in a crossword. Let's look at one of my favorite poems, The Marriage by Concertina Cruz. So between the first line, "Talk to me," she says, and 10 years later, and the second line, "He walks to the edge of the bed. There is a gap where the lines are cut." And one thing we can ask ourselves is, what does this do relative to the line that we've just read? Does it emphasize any aspect of what we've just read? In this case, it emphasizes the play on time and distance between the two people in the poem. We can also look at the use of well, em dash, as a repeating interruption in the next portion. First, let's check out the placement, right? What is she talking about in this portion of the poem? She's talking about useless remedies. And we know that this is kind of a cataloging portion of the poem because of the colon. So useless remedies, colon. Everything that follows is a useless remedy. And so by using well em dash to interrupt each remedy, it tells you how useless they are and how they may have tried this, but it didn't work. They're half done, they didn't get to kind of fulfill whatever it was they were trying to remedy. And then of course, let's look at the final two lines in this catalog of remedies where finally the well is not interrupted. The line reads, "The man who offers her a ride home and buys her a drink," cut, "means well." Here, well takes on a new meaning. It means well. It's no longer interruption or like something you say as a filler in speech. It becomes intention. It becomes like ironically just saying that someone has good intentions. And it also proceeds to actualize its meaning, to finish the sentence. And so it tells us that where the remedies were useless, infidelity will succeed. Or like this image of someone else, another man bringing her home, will succeed. And also it's more nuanced than just saying that like, oh, this is a poem about infidelity, right? By describing infidelity in a catalog of remedies, it also shows us that the persona's real problem in this marriage is loneliness and a want for visceral trappings of attraction and affection. You can use this way of reading, or at least structuring your questions, while going through poems with challenging forms. And like I said, just take your time. Just like reading itself, reading poetry takes practice, and it's also a skill. It's something that develops over time, and just because of the kind of nature of poetry, I also think it's good to read and reread poems more than once. Trust me, there will always be something that you didn't notice the first time that you read it. And I always think of poetry as kind of a trapdoor that just keeps on giving every time you open it up. To wrap up this video, I wanted to give you guys a couple of recommendations. These aren't full collections yet, but just a couple of poems that are available online for free, because I know that poetry books are super freaking expensive and I don't want anyone to go out and blow 900 pesos on something that they won't really enjoy. I will be leaving the link below to these 3 poems and also to the George Oppen poem from earlier. Unfortunately, I will not be able to put the Concertina Cruz poem in because I just scanned it from my copy of the book, and I'm not sure if that would be like a violation of some copyright if I uploaded it and gave it to you guys. The first poem I'd like to recommend is Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. I feel like lit majors who are watching this are going to laugh because we always take up that poem in class, but it's that way for a reason. Like, it's a really good poem, it's got really good imagery, the language is musical and subtle, but it's also very accessible because there's such a strong link there emotionally, and it also kind of shows us the link between human nature, human emotion, and wilderness, or like earthly nature. The second poem I would recommend is Sweetness by Stephen Dunn. This is such a good poem, and it's something that I have been reading a lot since my best friend died. It's about losing friends and being there with people through tragedies. It's just so good. Like, the line cuts, the musicality, and the internal rhymes are so beautiful. And the form is simple but intriguing. Like, if you sort of take time to reflect on it and keep looking at it, it will reveal new things to you. And last but not the least, I would like to recommend The Quiet World by Jeffrey McDaniel. This is something that never ever gets old for me because it's such a beautiful premise, and the line cuts and the meaning kind of enhance the narrative aspect of the poem, which is already very, very good. And I also really appreciate how there's like this humming sound that's kind of conjured by all of the silence that the poem talks about. Alright, now before we end, I will read you guys a poem because I feel like I haven't read a poem on here in a hot minute. This is from Pilgrim Bell by Kaveh Akbar. Vines by Kaveh Akbar. When I saw God, I trembled like a man. I used the wrong pronouns. God bricked up my mouth hole. His fists were white as gold. There were roaches in my beard. Now I live like a widow. Every day a heave of knitting patterns and sex toys. My family speaks of me with such pride, they say. His bread is an oil. I thank them for that, and for their chromosomes, most of which have been lovely. I am too lovely. To my body is hard and choked with juice like a plastic. Throat stuffed with real grapes. My turn-ons include roomy and fake leather. My turn-offs have all been ushered into the basement. I'll drink to them and to any victory roaches in my beard. I live now like a window. Fat, wet vines creep through onto my floors in the pipes and through the walls, gentle as blue flames they curl. My living there is ice in my attic, sugar on my tile. I am present and useless, like a nose torn from a face and set in a bowl. Damn, sis! Super ganda. Alright, anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you liked it, if you found it useful, let me know below. And if you're intimidated by poetry also, let's start a conversation. Let me know more about that in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!